Good morning. Good morning. Today is Columbus Day, and it's also Indigenous Peoples Day. And I would like to acknowledge that we are standing on the land of the original Catawba Nation and give homage to them as we respect their ancestors and their elders. Good morning and welcome. Welcome to the Fort Mill History Museum and the Fort Mill School District co-sponsored celebration of an official South Carolina historical marker for the George Fish School. I'm Dr. Constance Dunlap. I attended George Fish through 3rd grade, and I'm a member of the George Fish Historical Marker Committee. And on behalf of our committee, I welcome you to day 2 of our program. To get us started, we will first have the presentation of colors conducted by the Catawba Ridge, Nation Forward, and Fort Mill High School Junior ROTC. Following that, we're going to hear the national anthem and Lift Every Voice and Sing performed by the Fort Mill High School Band. Thank you. I would also like to clarify that we have heard from Fort Mill High School Wind Symphony 1 under the direction of Mr. Ren Patel. Thank you and welcome. So it's so good to see everybody. Yesterday afternoon, we enjoyed a screening of the Fort Mill History Museum-sponsored documentary of the George Fish School. Then after a welcome from the museum board chair, Dr. David Ward, and executive director, Ms. Christia Humberg, we were treated to a panel discussion moderated by Ms. Ann Evans. The panel featured George Fish School alumni, Mr. John Sanders, Ms. Cora Dunlap-Lyles, Rosenwald School scholar, Ms. J. Haley Milner, Nation Ford High School graduate and current junior at Clemson University Honors College, Ms. Rebecca Studer, and author, Julius Rosenwald scholar, and Rosenwald family member, and our guest invited speaker, Ms. Stephanie Dush. Let's give them another round of applause for yesterday. Today, we will build on yesterday's program. But first, allow me to provide some context by posing these questions. Why are we gathered here today? Why celebrate a historical marker? After all, a school was constructed in 1925, served a segregated African American community for 42 years, was integrated, renamed, sold, records were discarded, and the building demolished. Those are the facts. And that would be the story if not for the curiosity, passion, and commitment of a number of people. You see, the story of the George Fish School, like all U.S. history, is layered. It's complex. It has pain, disparity, erasure, and tragedy. It has pleasure in learning, resilience and unity of purpose, collaboration, and triumph. Like all history and all complex matters, it is not a matter of either or, but it is both and it is the integration of these disparate parts, what we consider the good and the bad, that we are here to acknowledge. For in order to be healthy, enlightened citizens, we must acknowledge the good and the bad, the whole story, in order to integrate meaning. This is the essence of learning, the essence of real education. Before we hear from our invited speakers, I would like to briefly share how this event came together. You know, some stories press forward to the surface to be heard. They refuse to remain buried. The story of George Fish School is one of these stories. While our historical marker officially convened in the summer of 2019, we would begin the story in earnest in 1912 when Dr. Booker T. Washington and Mr. Julius Rosenwald sat down to devise a plan to educate Negroes, ultimately in 15 states in the segregated South. I say Negroes to reflect the language of the Jim Crow era of the time. In 2006, George Fish alumni raised funds and 1 year later erected the Alumni Memorial Monument at the site of the former school. These men and women knew something of importance had happened here. In December 2019, an official South Carolina historical marker was erected near the site. And according to the South Carolina Department of Archives and History website, and I quote, South Carolina historical markers mark and interpret places important to an understanding of South Carolina's past, end quote. But a place is not just a physical location. By marking the site, we shed light on the grounds where caring, teaching, learning, and service occurred. On behalf of our committee, I am delighted that you have joined us. On a personal note, I have always enjoyed a sense of belonging to the George Fish School community. Being part of the 20th century great migration of African Americans to the North and the 21st century reverse migration to our homelands in the South, I have strong ties to many communities. And as a lifelong learner in my travels, I continue to make discoveries. One such discovery occurred as recently as 2019 when I realized as an adult that I was a member of the school district that is consistently ranked among the top performing districts in the state, That is the Fort Mill School District. And some of you may also be having this realization, because that was a belated integration of thought on my part. We hope as you leave here today that you will also embrace and integrate the history of George Fish School, the Fort Mill History Museum, and the Fort Mill School District. The museum's mission is to preserve Fort Mill's heritage for the benefit of present and future generations. The school district motto is "Children First, Every Day." The history of the George Fish School is a vital component of this history and mission. Thank you. Now, I would like to introduce Dr. James Chuck Epps. Chuck, as he is affectionately known. Chuck was educated in the Fort Mill schools before being appointed superintendent of the school district in 2009. He graduated in Fort Mill High School in the 60s. And he is here to provide another facet of the story, because as you see, the story of George Fish School is not just about the Black experience, it's also about others' experiences that were occurring while we were separated. Dr. Epps.
I actually graduated in 1970. I'm a little younger than 60s. Okay. Sensitive about that, you know. Let me begin by welcoming everybody to this historic day. This is a important part of the history of Fort Mill School District, the 1925 to 1968 period, or 68 period of time of the existence of George Fish School as a school that served black students. Every town, as you know from you may know, you may be too young to know this, every town had schools, segregated schools up until the late 60s in the South. So this was Fort Mill's segregated school for those years. Before I begin, let me welcome our board members who are here. And let me say this, our school board, you talk about the success of the school district. It's only as a result, or in part because of a strong school boards that we've had for so many years, as long as I can remember. We've had professional perspective on our school boards. We've had people who cared, who they don't get paid, they run for the right reasons. So I'd like to recognize them at this time. And if they're here, I see, if you'll stand, Christy Spears is here. And Christy was a student at Fort Mill Junior High. She went through, and George Fish, okay. Scott Frateroli, who worked and was a principal and taught here in Fort Mill schools. Any other board members? Am I missing anybody? Let's give them a round of applause. Okay, like Connie said, we're here for a couple of, we wouldn't be here except this thing got kicked off by 2 points of importance, I believe, just from reading through the materials. First, Cora Lyles discovered that it was a Rosenwald school in 2006. Is Cora here? Yes, I'm here. 2006 or so? Okay, so that was kind of a revelation through your research, and that's an important reason we're here. Also, we're here, and you may not realize this was the culmination, this historical marker unveiling was the culmination of a Girl Scout Gold Award, which is equal to the similar as the Boy Scouts Eagle Award project by Rebecca Studer, the student who is now a junior at Clemson. And she was here yesterday, but had to go back to class today. Her parents made her go to school, I guess, since they're writing a check to Clemson. But those two persons joined together unknowingly, and here we are today for this important event. We mentioned Rosenwald, and I need some of you who may not have been here yesterday, just a brief few comments about the importance of that. The Rosenwald School project built more than 5,000 schools, shops, and teacher homes in the United States, primarily for the education of African American children in the South during the early 20th century. The project was a product of the partnership of Julius Rosenwald, a Jewish American clothier who became part owner and president of Sears, Roebuck and Company, and the African American leader, educator, and philanthropist Booker T. Washington, who was president of the Tuckasegee Institute. In that term, Rosenwald was the founder of the Rosenwald Fund. He contributed seed money for many schools and other philanthropic causes. To encourage local commitment to these projects, he conditioned the fund support on the local community's raising of matching funds. To promote collaboration between black and white people, Rosenwald required communities to also commit public funds and or labor to the schools, as well as to contribute additional cash donations after construction. With the program, millions of dollars were raised by African American rural communities across the South to fund better education for their children, and white school boards agreed to operate and maintain the schools. So those are the facts of how the Rosenwald, and you'll learn more of that from our future speakers. The collaboration, as I said, the collaboration of Rosenwald and Washington led to the construction of almost 5,000 schools for black children in the 11 states of the former Confederacy, as well as Oklahoma, Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland. As a result of their collaboration, approximately 1/3 of African American children were educated in these schools. And in South Carolina, of the 5,000 and so schools, 480 something, I believe I read, were built in South Carolina. So specifically, the school building program was one of the largest programs administered by the Rosenwald Fund. Remember, they did teacher housing and did college scholarships. Using state-of-the-art architectural plans designed by professors at Tuckasegee Institute, the fund spent more than $4 million to build 5,388 schools, 217 teacher homes, 163 shop buildings in 883 counties in 15 states, from Maryland to Texas. Fulfilling the goals of the match grant program, and I believe I heard yesterday that this was one of the first matching grant programs that was in existence. African American communities contributed $4.8 million to the building of the 5,338 schools throughout the South. On a personal note, like Connie said, I was a high school student when we fully integrated, when we had a year of choice, and then we fully integrated. So I went to segregated schools for 10 of my school years, and then 2 years in the integrated system. I was actually, in those days, it was a little different. I had a first period study hall as a senior, and the principal and the superintendent asked me to be the school district courier, which I got in my car every day, which has a lawsuit written all over it, I guess, and drove to all the schools and delivered the mail during my first period planning, or first period free period. I should have been taking a math course because I had to take one that summer before I could go to Clemson. But anyway, I had bad advice from my guidance counselor, I guess. Plus, I was lazy at that point. And I was the mail courier, so that was my first. You realize now, going into the black school in the late '60s, I would drive in every day. So that was my first touching of George Fish School. Later, I was the assistant principal from 1983 to 80. I was 2 years the assistant principal for Stormy Young. So Gray, your dad, and I worked at the school. So I have a history there, and it was Fort Mill Junior High for those years. At some point, it became Fort Mill Middle, and I'm not sure if that was later in the 80s. That's my personal story to the school. The next, I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, who has some information from the town, Mayor Guynn Savage. I keep calling her Guynn Hosey, but it's Savage. And she's a dear friend of mine, and she was a student at the school as well. So at this time, let's welcome Guynn to the podium.
Good job. Good morning. I'm honored to be here, and thank you for allowing me these few minutes. A memorial is a visible reminder of something important, revered, treasured. The history of George Fish School is indeed treasured. Gandhi said that a small body of determined spirits, fired by an unquenchable faith in their mission, can alter the course of history. The missions of George Fish, Dr. Booker T. Washington, and Julius Rosenwald were to advance educational opportunities in areas that were underserved. Their unquenchable faith saw not just any school, but a brick school built to last in the center of a community with resources that would provide sports, music, education, connection. The town of Fort Mill has been my lifelong home, and I know it to be hardworking, caring, and compassionate. At an early age, it was abundantly apparent to me that this was a community that operated more like a family. I was very blessed to attend George Fish, and today I'm honored to read a proclamation that the town issued in March 2020. It's a little dry, so bear with me. George Fish School historical significance. Whereas the George Fish School was the culmination of an early 20th century vision to improve educational opportunities for African Americans in the rural South, shared between Dr. Booker T. Washington, president of Tuckasegee Institute, and Mr. Julius Rosenwald, philanthropist and president of Sears, Roebuck and Company. Whereas the six-teacher community school model was used to design the George Fish School, which was completed in 1926. The Central Consolidated School was situated on 4 acres of land and also had an accompanying faculty house. Whereas deviating from the accepted tradition of providing wooden plank structures in segregated communities, Mr. George Fish, Superintendent of Springs Cotton Mill Plants number 1 and number 2, successfully advocated for a brick structure design. The school was subsequently named for him, if you wondered where the name came from. Whereas from its completion in 1926 until 1968, the George Fish School served students and families in the segregated African American community of Paradise. It was staffed by dedicated African American educators who commuted from Indian Land, Rock Hill, Columbia, Chester, Gaffney, and surrounding areas. Whereas from 1968 until 1986, the George Fish School was integrated and served the wider Fort Mill community. It was renamed Fort Mill Junior High School and then Fort Mill Middle School. The building was sold in 1986 and later demolished. And whereas in 2006, alumni of the George Fish School under the leadership of Mr. John L. Sanders III, a 1964 graduate of George Fish School and president of the George Fish School Historical Alumni Committee, worked to establish a monument in 2007 at the former site of the school. George Fish School class of 1963 graduate Mr. Rufus Rudy Sanders designed the monument, and Duke Energy supported its erection on their grounds. And whereas in 2019, the George Fish School Historical Marker Committee was formed, the Fort Mill School District, under the leadership of Dr. Chuck Epps, sponsored the committee's application to the South Carolina Department of Archives and History to designate the George Fish School as a significant part of South Carolina's cultural and educational history. Whereas in December 2019, historical mark number 46-68, commemorating the George Fish School, was erected. Now therefore be it proclaimed that the town of Fort Mill recognizes the George Fish School and its legacy as an important part of Fort Mill's history. And this is signed by me. Again, this is a treasured memory and a treasured legend that helps us move to the future. I'm going to leave copies of this for those that might want it, and I am extremely grateful and honored to be here today. And I believe following me is a childhood friend of mine that grew into being a doctor of all things, Dr. David R. Ward. David, like myself, is an alumni, Fort Mill Junior High School, formerly George Fish. We never referred to it as Fort Mill Junior High, I don't think. He's also chairman of the Fort Mill History Museum Board of Directors and gives much of his life to assist in keeping Fort Mill that family that we all recognize. David?
You can't help but be in love with Fort Mill. You know, that's the whole thing. It's the greatest place in the world. It's got the greatest people. And if you guys could have been here yesterday, you would have heard some real heartfelt, just you could see the passion of the folks that were involved yesterday. And it was just so, it was just a privilege to be sitting here and listening to comments, to things. Because one of the things I look back, of course, being a historian, I look back, we're at 90, close to 96 years, 90, if you look at 96, 97 years of when George Fish was started. And the thing that I look back is, one of the things that I always heard, they may have had borrowed books. You know, they may have had borrowed band uniforms. They may not have had the best of stuff. But if you look at that community, when they walked in to that school, that was the community school. That was their school. Nobody else had used it. Nobody else had been there. It was theirs. And just to hear the stories, it just really resonated with me, just being able to, because I remember when I walked in there in the 7th grade, and of course, you don't appreciate things like everything else. The older you get, the more you appreciate things, especially history, because one thing is you've got more history under you. So that's the biggest thing right there. But when I walked into junior high at Fort Mill, George Fish, and it's like what Guynn said, we never referred to that as Fort Mill Junior High. It was always George Fish. You know, it was just that tradition. We wanted to continue it. But when we walked in, you know, you just don't realize some things when you walk into a situation. You look back now and can see how much you appreciated what was there and what that place meant to a lot of folks. As they say, I'm with the Fort Mill History Museum, and if you guys have not been to the Fort Mill History Museum, shame on you. You better come by and see us. Make sure you come by. This is where these things, this is where we capture all of the Fort Mill, the great things of Fort Mill. This being just instrumental in a vital part of that. So you make sure you come by, you make sure you get engaged, because this is the thing, like I said, we've got the sauce, we've got the recipe of the sauce that makes Fort Mill special, and that's how we share it with people. So that's why I want you to always get involved. I need to recognize a few folks that are here. Of course, just from the, I want to make sure that we've got 2 of the board members for the Fort Mill History Museum. You've already heard from one, and you'll be hearing from another one. Of course, Chuck, he's on the Fort Mill History Museum board, and former Mayor Danny Funderburk, who you'll hear in just a minute, he's on the Fort Mill History Museum board. I want to recognize Christia Humberg, the Executive Director for the Fort Mill History Museum. I know you've already seen my former next door neighbor, Guynn. We got Ben Hugdens from the Fort Mill Town Council. Also Rick Duran from Duke Energy, appreciate him. He's very supportive of not only the whole town of Fort Mill, especially with the museum. I appreciate that. I want to make sure that I know all the names were listed for the folks that were on the, and in fact, let's just go ahead and let everybody stand up right quick. I think we've said that for all those that were on the George Fish Historical Marker Committee. I want to make sure everybody stands up for that. I know Cora and Chuck and Rudy and Christia. So these are the folks that were behind the scenes. I told Connie yesterday that I'm going to really miss, even though we've got one scheduled for November, but I'm going to really miss our second Tuesday calls and to go through this. And she did a wonderful job getting this organized and pushing this and all the background with everybody on the team. It was just a great team effort, and I just appreciate that. So I'll now turn it over. I think I've got former Mayor Danny Funderburk will be coming up. Oh, are you going to? Well, wasn't listening right, was it?
No. Thank you, and thank you, David, for those remarks, and Mayor Savage and Chuck. I just wanted to pick up on something that I believe David mentioned, and that was the fact that the decision to erect a brick structure is something that Fort Mill should be proud of. I do believe that any school that is established to educate is important, whether it's a one-room wooden structure. Let me be clear. At the same time, a significant decision was made to erect a school that was brick and sizable. And I believe that the town should actually feel good about that and take credit for that. Continuing, I would like to introduce the George Fish School alumni. We have some wonderful representation of the George Fish School experience. And and each has been invited to share their perspective from their vantage point. We're going to start with former Mayor Danny Funderburk, who attended Fort Mill Junior High, the physical site of George Fish School. And he'll be followed by 1959 graduate, Miss Elizabeth Patterson White. And then we'll hear from 1963 graduate, Mr. Rufus Rudy Sanders. And finally, we will hear from 1966 graduate, Miss Juanita Nash Sanders.
Thank you, Connie. I don't have to move the microphone. Worked out pretty good for me. Sharing comments about something that's so important is always a pleasure. As former mayor, there were quite a few times when you're asked to speak about a subject that you don't know as much about as the folks who are in attendance. This, however, is a subject that I do have some experience at. As Guynn and I were talking prior to the beginning of the proceedings, in late 60s, that first class that attended Fort Mill Junior High, I was in the first 7th grade class. Glenn was in the first 8th. And of course, we went on to finish in the 8th grade and move on to high school. So we had a full 2 years in that school and became very attached to it. And as has already been stated, it was always George Fish to us. And we were glad to be there. It was a great school. And as you search for comments over and above the facts and the figures that are going to be shared here today, for me, it was something that was very sentimental. As a Bible believer, we're taught that the Lord speaks to you in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's that little whisper that many of us don't listen to. Other times it can be people, places, and events. And if you know me for any length of time, you know I'm a firm believer in people, places, and events. George Fish School, for me, satisfied all 3 categories. As I take a look at it, the event, of course, was full integration. It occurred in the late 60s. And I knew a lot of the kids, the black kids that we were going to school with, and we were friends. We played ball together. We competed on the athletic field. We ran into each other around town. And then all of a sudden, we're in school together, which further and deepened that relationship. It was the place itself, which was that stack of bricks that Connie referred to, that had been George Fish, and that had become Fort Mill Junior High, so we all had this school in common. And so that deepened that relationship even further. And then, of course, the most important component of that was the people. It was our peers, the folks that we were going to school with, both black and white. It was the teachers that took such an interest in our education, both black and white. And it was the community itself, black and white, that came together and made that happen in a time that had the potential for a lot of turbulence and a lot of friction. I personally don't remember anything like that. It was just a great experience for me. I've always been grateful for it. It has a special place in my heart, and I appreciate the opportunity to come up and share a few comments about that. I'm very anxious to hear what some of the other folks here have to say about it. But it was a great time and place, and the people, places, and events were extremely important to me, as I hope they were for everybody here. So thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Elizabeth Patterson White. I had a speech, but I don't know where it is. So I'm going to talk for a few moments off the top of my head. And I guess I'll just tell you how I feel and what I think about having graduated from George Fish. And I am the first Afro-American school bus driver from there. And I had my license since I was 14 years old. And I got my driver's license for the bus when I was 16. So, you know, I've been kind of responsible for a long time, not just for me, but for other people too. And by the way, I've got a sister here. It was 6 of us. And I have a sister here who is 90, and the next one is 91, and she couldn't be here today. But I'm the youngest, and I'll be 81 soon. So here's the key. I've always not tried to hide my age or anything, so might as well tell you today, I'm just as happy as I can be to be among you. And I have been retired for 20 years. And I want you to know I had no idea I could accomplish the things that I accomplished. And I have a book, and I've understood. Now, she said I had 3 minutes. I got a book right here, but I didn't write it. A girlfriend of mine wrote it from Bennett College. I'm going to put a book like this, and it's volume 3. I'm going to put it in the museum. And it's Tell Me Why, Dear Bennett. And it's Memoirs of Bennett College Belles, volume 3. And it's 3 books, and I'm in 3 of them. But I'm only going to put 1 in there right now. But to make a long story short, I have also accomplished a couple of things. I was valedictorian of my class at George Fish High. And I am also listed in Who's Who in American Education. And I kind of felt good about that. And I had forgotten about that until I was looking through some of the things that I came up to bring down here with me today. So if you get a chance, look at some of those posters. And my sister, my oldest sister, Mary Lee Zachary, Patterson Zachary, there is a 7th grade diploma or whatever they get. George Fish went only to the 7th grade. 1935, she left out of the 7th grade, and Mom and Dad had to look for some place for her to go to high school. So she went to Clinton Normal School. And anyway, each of my sisters and I graduated from high school, and I've got a list out there with our names on it when we graduated. But they tried to add the 12th grade on in 1944 and not let my brother graduate, and he was the only graduate for that year. But somehow Mom and Dad got together with the right people, and they were able to get him out of there. So he graduated by himself. So his name is 1944 alone. Okay? So to make a long story short, I had some other things I was going to mention to you, but I'm retired principal of a school. That was my last job. But I read proposals in Washington, D.C., and I was there for 4 days, and I was one of, I think it was 3 or 4 of Afro-Americans on this team. But I had a lot of experience. My parents worked for Colonel and Mrs. Elliott White Springs for 34 years, and we were exposed to a lot of things through them. And of course, I've traveled a little bit, Germany, Hawaii, South America, and other places. And I got a lot of things I could tell you, but I'm going to sit right down and let Connie come on. Because Connie, you haven't given me the time, but I know it's time up. Thank you.
Good morning and happy Indigenous Day to all. Let's celebrate. We're going to go back to the opening day of the George Fish School, the new school. On opening day, early March, it was within the first week of March, 1926. It was slated to open in 1920, the bottom part of the 1925, but due to supplies were short getting in, so it opened earlier in 1926. On opening day, Professor Elliott Littleton Avery assembled the students from the Negro Graded School, the old academy, near Bank Street. They marched 1 mile north, crossing over Tom Hall Street, and then continuing that march down Rocky Street. Where is Rocky Street? Fast forward 25 years, and Rocky Street was renamed Steel Street. Why was it renamed Steel Street? the only African American that lost his life in World War II, Nathan Steele Jr. It was in tribute to him. Now, while walking north on Rocky Street, they came to the foot of the steps of the new school, George Fish School. The ringing of a handbell signaling the students to march single file up those steps into the big auditorium and chapel. Now, this is where the story starts. Beatrice White, age 14, entering the chapel auditorium, saying, "It is so beautiful. It looks like a college." This is what she shared with me in 2007. She was the oldest living George Fish alumni and passed away June 9th, 2009, at the age of 98. She was fondly referred to throughout the community as Aunt B. We loved her, and she is gracing looking down at us now. We, the alumni of George Fish School, thoroughly understand the sentiments in that expression of the young student. So thank you, and thank everyone for coming out to promote and then to get this part of history, because it's just the beginning. Thank you so much.
Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I think whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged the punishment, the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Now, some of you might wonder, what in the world does this have to do with George Fish? Well, I learned this in my English class, Miss Nichols. We had fantastic teachers, excellent teachers, devoted teachers, compassionate teachers, caring teachers, teachers who challenged us to do our very, very best. And guess what? You still have fantastic teachers, for you are in the Fort Mill School District, #1. Yes. These teachers prepared us for our future. These teachers instilled in us perseverance if we are knocked down. Just like Maya Angelou would say, still I rise. We get up. We continue. And this is what was instilled in us at George Fish School, a segregated school, a school that did not have everything, but a school that dared to challenge us, to produce in us, and we went on to become teachers, doctors, lawyers, superintendents, and the list goes on. We celebrate George Fish. I am a product of a segregated school, but guess what? I came back to an integrated school. The old George Fish that had become Fort Mill Middle School in 1985. I worked as a professional, a teacher for 45 years, and I'm quite sure some of you might say, boy, she's old. Yes, I am old. And when we think of George Fish, a school that dared to challenge us, we say, thank you, George Fish.
So Juanita, we could just sit down, but we do need to hear from Stephanie. But first, let's hear again from Fort Mill High School Wind Symphony 1 under the direction of Mr. Ren Patel. And let me also convey their regrets that they would not be able to stay and hear your remarks, Stephanie, because they need to get around to the historic marker where we're going to throw down as a band. I now have the privilege of introducing our guest speaker, Ms. Stephanie Dush. And again, context is important. So we have heard that in 2008, we learned that George Fish School was a Rosenwald school, but we really didn't know what that meant. In 2011, Stephanie published her book, You Need a Schoolhouse, Booker T. Washington, Julius Rosenwald, and the Building of Schools for the Segregated South, which has done more to shed light on the Booker T. Washington-Rosenwald collaboration and legacy than any other resource I'm aware of. In 2019, our committee began to formulate a plan to celebrate the historical marker. We invited Stephanie, and she did not hesitate. We were ready at the beginning of 2020. We had the pandemic, but reconnected, and she said, I'm there. Stephanie grew up in Arlington, Virginia, as the daughter of a Foreign Service officer, also in New England and France. She holds a BA in Russian Studies from Brown University and an MA from Harvard in Soviet Union Area Studies. In addition to being active in the campaign to create a Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historical Park, Stephanie is a wife, mother, and grandmother of, is it 6 boys and 1 girl? I introduce Ms. Stephanie Dush.
Thank you so much, Connie. It is just such a huge pleasure for me to be here with you all. I mean, I hope I can get through my remarks. You move me to tears, honestly. The band is so wonderful. Your memories, hearing you recite is so wonderful. Being with all of you, it thrills me and moves me. And I'm happy to be here. Many of you are aware, I suspect, that in your effort to preserve and honor the memory of the school built by your community, with financial assistance from the Rosenwald Fund, you're not alone. In the years since 2002, when the National Trust for Historic Preservation named the Rosenwald Schools to its annual list of most endangered historic sites in America, the movement to find, document, and preserve Rosenwald school buildings and the memories associated with them has spread. Some states have worked hard to document their schools and determine how many are still standing. People often ask me how many are still standing, and we really don't know, though some states can tell you exactly, but these schools were so rural, it takes work to figure out exactly how many are still there. Others have offered cultural grants to assist grants seeking to restore their schools. And the National Trust's African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund has facilitated several school restorations. I was in Asheville, North Carolina last weekend, where the Mars Hill School was restored with one of those grants. And now, as Connie mentioned, a campaign is underway to create a Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historical Park to ensure that the memory of the remarkable three-way partnership that led to the creation of the schools, which are spread from the suburbs of Washington, D.C. and Maryland to the piney woods of East Texas, to make sure this is not forgotten. Well, why is this story so powerful? Why did you all put so much energy into it? What does George Fish School have to say to the larger community here in Fort Mill, and indeed all across South Carolina and our country? What was the partnership that created these schools and empowered communities, and how did it come about? Well, the basic outlines of this story are, I suspect, familiar to you. Julius Rosenwald was a son of German-Jewish immigrants, born in 1862 in Springfield, Illinois. He grew up across the street from Abraham Lincoln's house. On Saturdays, he worked in his father's clothing store. Julius Rosenwald never graduated from high school. When he was 16, he went to New York to learn all aspects of the clothing business, retail and wholesale, from his successful uncles there. And in 1895, having moved back to the Midwest to Chicago and having become a somewhat successful manufacturer of men's clothing, Julius had the opportunity to buy into a small, unknown mail order company called Sears Roebuck, which I suspect I'm not alone in remembering getting many things from Sears as a child, including my first baby doll. The timing was good. and Rosenwald was an astute manager. By the time he was in his mid-40s, he was a millionaire many times over. From his Jewish identity, Rosenwald had a sense of social responsibility. He had absorbed the teaching of tzedakah, giving that is motivated by a sense of justice and fairness, rather than caritas, the Christian concept which is more motivated by love. He had been taught that if you have more than you need, it is your responsibility, your obligation to share from your abundance, to extend a genuinely helping hand. And from events around him in the first century of the 20th century, Julius was developing an awareness of racial inequities in this country. I mentioned this yesterday. In 1908, there was a 3-day race riot in his hometown in Springfield, Illinois. At this time, American Jews were giving money to help victims of pogroms in Europe. Julius began to equate racial animus here with the anti-Semitism and lack of opportunity that had made his parents and so many others leave Europe for new lives in this country. Well, in 1910, one of his colleagues gave Julius Rosenwald a copy of Up From Slavery, Booker T. Washington's memoir, which I expect many of you have read. Julius was impressed by the story it told of Washington's life, starting in his childhood enslaved on a small family farm in the western part of Virginia. A memorable scene from that book describes Booker as a young boy, emancipated, but still having to work in a coal mine to help his family, creeping close in the dark to 2 men he hears talking. They're describing a school that is especially for Black people, and you don't have to pay to go there. It's called Hampton Institute. It was a place that was created by the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War to train Black teachers. So through great determination and encouraged by a woman he had been working for, Booker was able to get there. And in my book, there's a photograph of him at his graduation from Hampton in 1875, and he has a very interesting expression of mingled pride and anxiety. He surely was uncertain about what lay ahead. But just as Rosenwald could not have imagined the success and wealth that would be his, Washington surely did not imagine that he would become the most well-known African-American of his day. In 1881, he was selected to create a school similar to Hampton in rural Alabama near a town called Tuskegee. Through Washington's hard work and determination, the school succeeded. In 1895, he was invited to speak at the Atlanta Cotton States and International Exposition. We talked about this a little yesterday. The speech he gave there brought him widespread attention and acclaim. Detractors later called it the Atlanta Compromise, but its immediate effect was to bring Washington fame. The great Frederick Douglass had died just a few months before the speech, and so many people, both Black and white, turned to Washington as a new leader. In 1901, President Theodore Roosevelt invited him to dinner at the Executive Mansion, an act so controversial in the poisonous racial climate of that day that it would be many years before anything like that would be repeated. When in the spring of 1911, Rosenwald had the opportunity to meet Washington, he jumped at it, hosting a luncheon for him in Chicago. The 2 men hit it off. The day after the luncheon, Rosenwald invited Washington to tour the enormous state-of-the-art Sears Roebuck campus. The 2 men had lunch in the executive dining room, and they discovered that they had much in common. They were both practical, pragmatic people, resorts-oriented, proud of their accomplishments, and eager to build on them to do more. So Washington invited Rosenwald to come visit Tuskegee. In the fall of 1911, Rosenwald hired a private railroad car and filled it with relatives and friends, among them Jane Addams of Hull House and his rabbi, Emil Hirsch. They took the 2-day trip down to Tuskegee, and what they saw there impressed them. The beautiful campus that had been built by students of bricks they made right there, the dedicated faculty, the hundreds of eager students. At a service in the chapel, Rosenwald and his group heard the students sing the plantation songs that we have come to call spirituals, music that he and his friends had never heard before, and they were tremendously moved. When Washington asked Rosenwald to join the board of Tuskegee, he accepted. A high point for me in my research into all this was an interview I had with Julius Rosenwald's youngest child, his son, William. He was over 90 when I talked to him, but he remembered clearly that Washington had come as a house guest to his family's home. At the time, Billy, as his parents called him, was about 9. I asked him what he thought of Washington. He said, well, he didn't think anything much about him, but he did wonder why he and his father spent so much time talking to each other. They went in his father's office and closed the door and stayed there for hours. I think I know at least part of what they were discussing. Julius Rosenwald had much to learn about conditions in the South, about the unequal distribution of funds between schools for whites and schools for blacks. Washington explained to him that there were many places in the South where children, despite donations from previous philanthropists, had no schools at all, black children especially. In many places, local men and women, farmers, sharecroppers, domestic workers, people who were far from wealthy, were raising money to provide schools, determined that their children would get the education that they and their forebears had been denied for so long. Just as they had raised money to build churches after emancipation, now they wanted schools. This impressed Julius Rosenwald, who had already experimented with matching grants and liked the concept of collaborative rather than top-down philanthropy. So the result of this relationship between Washington and Rosenwald was a program that began small, with 6 schools in Macon County, where Tuskegee is, that were built by the communities with money they had raised and an equal sum from Rosenwald, and then they were given to the public school systems. That program became so popular that when Rosenwald died in 1932, the fund that carried his name had contributed to the buildings, as you've heard before, of over 5,000 schools, shop buildings, and teachers' homes. There were 481 schools here in South Carolina. The public school systems that administered these buildings contributed by far the most money to their construction. And one of the brilliant things about this program was that it pulled in the public school systems that had been really dragging their feet about creating schools. But dollar for dollar, the people in the communities the schools were built to serve donated more than did Julius Rosenwald. In many, many places, the schools became important centers of community life, from ball games and maypole celebrations to community fish fries to meeting sites for the NAACP chapters and headquarters for voter registration drives. By the early 1950s, 1/3 of the African-American children in the South were being educated in Rosenwald schools, and many people who had graduated from them were contributing to the growing pressure for equality and civil rights. I'm often asked why these schools are called Rosenwald schools rather than Washington schools, or something that acknowledges Washington's enormous input into their creation. Washington died in 1915, just as the program was getting started. But Julius Rosenwald was determined to carry it on. In 1920, the Rosenwald Fund was really overwhelmed with requests for new schools, so it set up an office in Nashville, Tennessee, to administer the schoolhouse program. The vast majority of schools were named neither for Washington nor for Rosenwald. They had names selected by the communities that built them. They were called Hope, Gethsemane, Short Journey, Sweet Home, Mount Zion, Allison Creek, Fort Mill. The majority of children who attended the schools had never heard of Julius Rosenwald. Rosenwald schools became a sort of administrative shorthand, familiar to those seeking the fund's assistance, but not necessarily to the community at large, as you know from having had to do research to discover that your school was a Rosenwald school. It took about 20 years for the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 that segregation in schools was unconstitutional to take effect. And during that time, most of the Rosenwald schools closed. Some buildings were put to other uses by the counties that owned them. Some passed into private hands, and some became shops, homes, facilities for storing hay or tobacco. But as the alumni of the schools got older, there was in many places a recognition of what these generally small and unglamorous buildings represented. The determination of their ancestors to provide for their children the education that had been so long denied, first to the enslaved, and then for many years to their descendants. Increasingly, the schools were remembered with affection and recognized as a source of pride, a powerful example of making a way out of no way. Several years ago, I visited an unrestored Rosenwald school in the northern neck of Virginia. It was actually a school that had changed its name in 1932 to become the Julius Rosenwald School, so it was unusual in that way. In the boarded-up shop building next to the school, I noticed a box, and from it, I pulled out what proved to be a dusty civics textbook from 1920. The first sentence on the first page was this: "The purpose of the public school is to educate students to become good citizens." Nowadays, we sometimes value education for what it does for us as individuals, allowing us to learn and grow and find out what interests us, to develop the means to support ourselves. And it is, of course, that. But a democracy only works when its citizens are engaged, when they think about contemporary issues, discuss them with their friends and neighbors, and try to figure out the best ways to produce the best results for the greatest number of people. That is what it means to be a good citizen. Knowing that their parents and forebears had contributed to creating the school, seeing them participate in regular school cleanups to keep the school in good order, knowing their teachers as members of their communities, their neighborhoods, and churches, the young people who attended the George Fish School learned valuable lessons. You all learned valuable lessons that served you well as you went out into the world. The community is better off for those efforts. The highway marker for the George Fish School will be a reminder to all of us and to unknown travelers for years to come of the value of hope, resilience, and education to bring communities together and to strengthen and empower us all. These schools are, or should be, precious to all of us, a reminder that we're at our best when we work together and when we truly live up to our ideals. Thank you so much for all you are doing to keep this valuable story alive.
Stephanie, thank you for those remarks and for the work that you're doing to make sure that this chapter is accessible to all Americans. And I just want to make a comment about something you said yesterday in talking about the controversy between Dr. Du Bois and Dr. Washington. And it's an example of people creating either-or thinking. Du Bois was better and Booker T. Washington wasn't. And, you know, I think about the number of places where I've been educated. I was telling someone in my family, I have a number of Georges in my education. George Fish, Georgetown University School of Medicine, George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences, where I did residency. And the point of sharing that is, while I'm quite educated, this is education, learning what Washington did to promote the education of blacks, which was overshadowed by Dr. Du Bois's work. And that is not to be dismissed, but this is another example of integration. So thank you. So I want to thank each person who participated yesterday and today's speakers. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge a few others. And if I miss someone, you know the saying, charge it to my head, not to my heart, and I do mean that. First, the George Fish School community, alumni, family and friends who have traveled from afar, the George Fish alumni who have organized events, including those that were organized as early as the 1970s. Members of the Fort Mill School District, the communications and marketing team, Joe Burke, Jenny Overman, and Tamara Osborne and their teams, the Fort Mill History Museum volunteers, Arthur Brown, Cassandra Dunnings, Keisha Hensley Sanders, and Ethel Faye Sanders, who have been a driving force on the George Fish School Facebook page, which we will keep alive. Duke Energy for their support. The leadership of the Greater Bethlehem Baptist Church, the Jerusalem Missionary Baptist Church, and the United AME Zion Church, because they're actually providing parking today near the monument. And the other members of the George Fish Historical Marker Committee, Chuck Epps, Christian Humberg, Corbett Dunlap Lyles, Rudy Sanders, and David Ward. Thank you so much. And just a little housekeeping. I'm going to try to give directions, but you all correct me because you know I'm not here. As you leave here, I think the best route to the marker is to leave the school district complex, turn right, and continue until you get to Steele Street, and then turn right, and you'll enter the Paradise community. The Jerusalem Church is on the right, United is on the left. There may be enough parking, and then up at 401 Steele Street would be the marker. We will